I am live, internal sadist, and I'm going to talk about my views, my unbiased views on reparations for all intents and purposes. Because I talked about it a very little in the last stream, and the sad part about that is, it's this is going to be my full unbiased views on reparations. It's not the fact that I don't believe that people don't deserve it. It's more or less the fact that when it comes down to it, it's all about how it can be properly allocated and how it can actually be properly done without any problems or incidents for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to give a group of people money, you got to worry about several things. You got to balance several things in the same process. Because at the end of the day, you got to worry about their mental state, and you got to worry about um, if they might need a beneficiary to other things like that. That's not including the fact that they got to determine if a person deserves it, how much they deserve, and this, that, and the other. I'm basically going to go off the premise that we'll say a good example of this is we'll say about 47 million black people, we'll say 48 million black people are going to get 100,000 dollars each. Now, when you hear that number, the first thing that pops into my mind is how it's going to be spent and how it's going to be allocated. If you know anything about black people, they tend to spend it on a lot of shit that they don't need or a lot of shit that they want. It's typically would be like tax season when you get your income taxes and you go spend it on, you go splurge and shit like that, and you have nothing to show for it after the fact, or you buy a car that you don't really plan on paying for after that, and you tend to lose your car. Typically, a lot of shit like that happens with a lot of African Americans and a lot of people in general. So, like, I see it as a much more ridiculous amount if you were getting tax returns for all intents and purposes. So we'll say 100,000. We'll just say every single black person in the United States gets $100,000. Now there'll be two problems with that whole entire thing. One, there'll be an economic problem with that, and two, there would be a plethora of other problems on the African American community when it comes down to it. Typically, I tend to look at it like this: criminal Tico would flip it multiple times. What's the saying? I'm gonna turn a penny to 100K. And before anybody actually says anything, if you know anything about the streets, that means I'm gonna turn a penny to more than I'm gonna flip that about 100,000 times for all intents and purposes. Is what that means. Meaning that 100K to me is a penny, and I'm about to flip it 100,000 times. That's typically what I would think of as Tico the criminal. Tico the Santali, I would think of that in a matter. I would think that in terms of I'm going to invest it in hotels and gas stations and stuff like that for all intents and purposes. So I'm probably invested in motel, hotel, gas station, stuff like that. And I'll probably turn around and like put some up so it can actually collect money and stuff along the lines of that. That's Tico de Santali. Tico de Maroon, I'd probably hide it somewhere and wait just in case shit happens for all intents and purposes. Tico de Jamaican, I'm buying a burgundy Benz and two big bikes. Pretty much is how it's going to work. So this is typically how I'm actually breaking it down based on mindset for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that, when you get to mindset and you get to certain people, you realize that black people aren't exactly the greatest people to just hand a bunch of money to and expect them to actually spend it properly for all intents and purposes. And what I mean by that is, like I said, just think about tax season when black people get their tax returns. Think about how fast that shit is gone. Think about how fast they get the shit and how fast it's gone. Yeah, I was about to get into that, Mikton and Win. Thanks for joining the live stream. Um, but typically, the problems with that is the initial problems is, do these black people need a beneficiary, and how would it be allocated properly? We'll just say that. Then we'll get into the whole entire economic problem behind why handing $100,000 to black people is a bad thing. We'll get into I'll start with the whole entire thing with the I'll start with the psychological aspect of that thing. I personally believe because when a certain group of people get taught that a certain thing or taught to believe a certain thing about themselves, they typically buy things to make themselves feel better about themselves. And the sad part about that is these things don't always work in their favor, or they're not always things to actually make them feel good about. They're just things that short term make them feel good about themselves. A good example of that is rappers and basketball players who tend to file for bankruptcy after being in the game or getting out of the game for all intents and purposes after not making too many hit records. That's a good sign that 9 times out of 10, these African Americans don't really have a good head on their shoulders when it comes to money. Now, I'm not saying all African Americans don't. I'm gonna say about anywhere between 7 to 12% of African Americans of the 12.9% of about 7 to 12% of the 12.9 African Americans who live in the United States do have a pretty good head on their shoulders. The majority is pretty much up. The rest of them is pretty much up in the air, and that's just real. That's just real life. That's just realistic facts and numbers for all intents and purposes. About 7 to 12% of them have a really good head on their shoulders, and they will spend it properly and allocate it properly. Whereas the rest of it, they probably buy like 2 pairs of the same pair of Jordans, or they'll buy an Escalade, or they'll buy something ridiculous for all intents and purposes with the money. That being said, back to the psychological aspect of it, I believe that if you're going to do this, you should actually invest in therapy for all these people, because at the end of the day, you need to unfuck the mental status that you actually put these people in. So I believe that they should get therapy to basically unfuck them from the horrors that they actually went through and learned. However, not everybody's going to actually break out of that. So there's going to be a large chunk of people either who don't get reparations or end up with beneficiaries for all intents and purposes. It's typically how it's going to work, because if they can't psychologically unfuck themselves, then pretty much that will require them either not to get reparations and or end up with a beneficiary for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is, how it actually works is based on Black people's spending habits and the stuff that Black people spend money on versus the stuff that Black people actually need. Versus, it's basically a wants versus a need for all intents and purposes. So when they actually spend the money, it's usually on something asinine for all intents and purposes. Very rarely do you actually see an African American spend money on something and invest money on something that they actually need, or invest money into stuff like that, unless it's like the 7 to 12% of African Americans who actually have a pretty good head on their shoulders when it comes to finances. As I was talking about, there's a large chunk of African Americans who make it big and end up bankrupt, or make it big and end up filing for bankruptcy later on down the line. So it's one of those things where, like, you got to teach them how to actually be financially savvy and be financially responsible. The question is, are they actually going to be financially savvy and financially responsible when you get done with their teachings and stuff like that? Because there's a lot of Black people that would just go with the flow and then be like, yeah, give me money, and then they'll go and like buy some, go spend erratically. Typically, Black people tend to spend like women at a per sale and shoe sale for all intents and purposes. The best way to put it. Let's just say women. You hand a woman your credit card and you tell her there's a sale at the store, and she'll come back and you'll see how you'll find out how much of a dent is in your credit card. For all intents and purposes, is typically how Black people spend. They basically will spend, and the sad part about that, Black people, sometimes you'll see Black people, they'll buy 2 pairs of the same shoe, same color and everything, but if you give them more money, they'll buy 3 pairs of the same shoe, and some other craziness. For all intents and purposes, is typically how it works. So the way they allocate money and spend money is going to be the problem overall. And the fact that they're not financially savvy will make for a big problem down the line economically, for all intents and purposes. The sad part about that is, now that we're talking about economically, if you gave every single Black person $100,000, that would immediately shock the whole entire market. for all intents and purposes. And for black people, go, well, I don't care. I just want the money. The problem with that is now over a million people, now over 40 something million people, actually, I'll say 48 million people actually have $100,000. That would shock the market, and it might collapse the market, and or it might make shit more expensive in the market. So typically, you would pay, like, let's say $3 and $4.68 for some milk. If you gave every single black person $100,000, that's going to take the milk prices up to about roughly about $20-$30, if not more than that, a gallon. So milk was going to cost $20-$30 a gallon for all intents and purposes, and that's probably being nice. Then you also got to worry about the prices of other stuff going up. Let it be fruit, let it be any old type of goods, let it be toiletries, let it be feminine products, let it be razors, let it be everything, let it be gas, let it be the whole entire market. Everything's going to go up in price for all intents and purposes, because at the end of the day, it's going to be way worse than just handing people an income tax check, because it's going to be way more money than an income tax check. So, like, shoes are going to go up, milk is going to go up, food's going to go up, gas is going to go up, everything's going to go up in price. And the sad part about that is there's a lot of people that's actually not getting this $100,000. I'm just saying roughly, saying roughly, if they handed every black person $100,000, this is typically how it worked. Now, there's people who are not getting this $100,000 who got regular paying jobs that's now got to pay more money for milk and all their goods and all their products for all intents and purposes, because you just shocked the shit out of the market by handing every single black person $100,000. With that being said, if you shock the market like that, 9 times out of 10, if you can't really recover the market or you can't really do anything to stabilize it, it's probably going to crash very hard for all intents and purposes. So stocks are going to boom, then they're going to crash, like the Great Depression, or worse than the Great Depression for all intents and purposes. And there's going to be a lot of people losing a shirt off their backs again, and a lot of people even in worse predicaments than they were during the Great Depression, during the last recession. It's typically how it's going to work. So there's going to be a lot of people out of jobs. There's going to be a lot of people that, because the sad part about that, when they give them the money, them spending this money is going to create a lot of jobs, but it's going to create a lot of temporary jobs. And the sad part about that is when the money's all gone, which will be pretty quickly with African Americans, those jobs tend to go away. So, like I said, you'll shock the market, and then you'll take away things out of the market, and then you'll end up with a lot of people unemployed again. It's simply how that works. And on top of that, you still have to address the mental status of African Americans in the United States, so you can go about this in a proper light or a proper way. Because if you don't, then you're going to end up with a lot of shit happening. And this is typically what I broke down at the beginning of this live stream when I said, basically, when I broke down the mentality of black people into 4 different groups. Tico the criminal will flip the money. Turn a penny to 100K for all intents and purposes. And like I was saying, if you don't know what I mean, that means I'm gonna flip that money 100,000 times. So I'm gonna have like $10 billion, I think it is, by the time I'm done flipping it. And that's being nice. That's being very nice and being very conservative on how much I can get by flipping it if I'm a criminal. It's typically how that works. Tico the Jamaican would buy a burgundy Benz and 2 big bikes. That's typically how that would work. That's another mindset. Tico the Santali Tico the Santal would actually buy a motel and probably a couple gas stations, probably 2 motels and a gas station for all intents and purposes. That's typically how that will work in that mindset. And Tico the Maroon would actually stash it away just in case shit happens for all intents and purposes. So this is typically how this stuff would actually happen and work, and based on 4 different mindsets. Tico the Libertarian would probably break it up in quarters and actually do all 4 things. So I would probably do something criminally and flip it multiple times, and 25,000 multiple times, and I would take the other 25,000 and go do this. I would take the other 25,000. I'd probably go invest in a gas station. Then I would go probably buy a motel on top of that. Then the other ones is like the other 25,000. I'd probably buy a low price car and a motorcycle for all intents and purposes, and then the other 25K I would probably just hide somewhere and let it collect interest, or just hide it somewhere safely. Now these are the four mindsets I'm going with. Typically, how this will work is in a black community, like Wim was saying, there's a high chance that a lot of black people are going to get very, very stingy and very, very, very violent with certain people about stuff like that. So now you got to worry about the elderly people being taken advantage of. You got to worry about people being robbed for their reparation money for all intents and purposes, because that's typically how it's going to work. No matter how much you like it or not, that's typically how it's going to work. Because people are going to think, well, if I rob this person, I can have more money. And especially if they know everybody else got money, it's going to go down in that fashion for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, they can get more money from somebody, or they can swindle somebody out of some money. That's typically how it's going to work. So there's going to be a lot of crime that happens when you hand all these black people this money. So what you're going to get is you're going to get elderly people being taken advantage of. You're going to have people. You're going to have people that are being robbed at gunpoint, or robbed at knife point, or just robbed in general for all intents and purposes. Then you're going to have people that are being swindled or scammed out of their money for all intents and purposes. Is typically how it's going to work. So those crimes are going to go up. Then you're going to have the black people. You're going to have the older black people who don't believe in putting money in the bank, and they pretty much put it in their mattress or literally put it in the TV set. So therefore, their younger generation will probably rob them, start skimming money from them when they start finding their money for all intents and purposes. So now that elderly person no longer has their money because they didn't believe in putting it in the bank, and they don't believe in banks, or they believe banks are safe. So typically what's going to happen is those elderly people are going to get robbed for their money by their own family members. If not, they're going to get robbed by a person else, another person who lives in their neighborhood. It's typically how that's going to work. Um, Another problem that you'll run into with reparations, besides the whole entire financial and economic thing, is the lack of money management, and the fact that black people typically, I'm basing it off the fact that if you ever looked in history or looked at famous stars that were once famous and all of a sudden now they're broke, and or if you ever watched the lovely Tren with income tax check season, where black people would spend so much money on Lord knows what and have nothing to show for it in under a month or under 2 weeks for all intents and purposes. And this is typically how a lot of this money would be spent. Basically, like Lord knows what, and nothing to show for it in a matter of weeks or a month for all intents and purposes. And this is typically how it's going to be done. And the sad part about that, it's going to be the most asinine shit for all intents and purposes, which makes for a very bad economy if they just go out spending the shit willy nilly. Another problem that you'll run into is the people not putting the money back into the economy. So there'll be a lot of people that'll sit there and hold it for a rainy day. Typically, what I said about Tico, Tren, and Maroon, people are going to sit there and hold on to it as if it's the last money that they'll ever get. They're not going to want to spend it, and it's going to be one of those things where they're going to pretty much it's pretty much going to be like something like a trophy to them for all intents and purposes, like, or an award to them. Then you also have the, like I was saying, the 7 to 12% of African Americans who would actually spend the money on a business or investments and shit like that. That's only 12 to 7. That's 7 to 12% of African Americans who actually do that. Out of the 12.9% of African Americans, only 7 to 12% of them would actually, start a business or have a business or something along the lines of that. And that's typically how that works. So the sad part about that, once you sum it all up, at the end of the day, what's up, Shinobi One? Yeah, like you said, you would buy a new truck company for all intents and purposes, make time to win. You're one of those 7 to 12% of African Americans who would do that. What's up, Shinobi One? But typically, how it works is you cannot hand people money who suck at managing money. That's basically like handing an NBA contract to a high schooler and expecting him to be mentally okay and mentally stable when in fact he's not mentally stable, or handing a crackhead or bringing a crackhead in a room and putting 10 kilos of crack in front of them and telling them that I know that you're trying to quit. Don't touch this crack for all intents and purposes. So basically, you're setting a group of people up for failure. In other words, is what I'm saying. By just handing them hundreds of thousands of dollars for all intents and purposes for reparations. And I'm just basically working off of a certain number that sounded reasonable to me that they would probably hand out to 48 million black people for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is at the end of the day, it makes for a very interesting dynamic, and it'll make for a very interesting market. It will make for a very interesting economic a short-term economic prosperity and a long-term collapse for all intents and purposes, and an inflation, a high inflation. So like if you give everybody black person $100,000, typically all the prices are going to go up around that $100,000 for all intents and purposes. It's typically like the story of Mance Musa whenever he went across to actually visit under kingdoms or visit people or make trades or make deals for trades. He typically would take a shit ton of gold with him, and everywhere he goes, he would hand out gold like it's fucking water. And the sad part about that is when he did that, it totally fucked up the whole entire economic. It fucked up the whole entire economics in Africa for a long period of time, and it took a while for it to actually come back to normal for all intents and purposes. And that's typically what you would be doing if you handed $100,000 to 42 million people, 48 million people for all intents and purposes. You would be pretty much collapsing the market or putting a depressing the market for all intents and purposes. Don't get me wrong, there will be a short surge in gains in the market, but at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, the market's going to recede and it's going to collapse. And the sad part about that is, along with that recession and collapse, the prices of all goods are going to go up drastically. So like I was saying, a $4 gallon of milk will probably set you back like $20 to $30 for all intents and purposes. A Big Mac meal at McDonald's, a Happy Meal, I think is normally about like, I want to say what, $2.99 is going to set you back down to $10 or $20 for a Happy Meal for all intents and purposes. And it's stuff like that people don't really think of around handing out this kind of money for all intents and purposes. This is typically why when the government hands out stimulus checks, it's only like $1,000, so they don't really create some crazy adverse effects on the market for all intents and purposes. So for all technicality, if you're going to hand out $100,000 to 48 million people, you would basically have to hand it out like it's a paycheck for all intents and purposes, and that would be the best way you could probably pull it off and make it work. That's if they decide to even remotely go at reparations, which I highly doubt. No matter who's in office, they always talk a good game about giving out reparations, but at the end of the day, they never really give out the reparations. It's typically how it works. And the sad part about that is we pretty much all know how that will work anyway. But at the end of the day, we all know that it's not going to happen, which makes for a very sad reality when it comes to reparations in the United States. Is pretty much how it'll work. So if they actually did give it out in a large sum to everybody, you would typically create a very hostile market or a very hostile economic situation around everybody. Because at the end of the day, like I said, all the prices are going to go up. And the sad part about that is everybody who's making their normal wages, the prices are going to go up for them too. So it's going to create a slight, I'm not even going to say slight bit. It's going to create some civil unrest, and some people are going to be very upset with the prices, everything around them, from gasoline to milk to, toiletries to everything you could pretty much think of that they would normally buy on a regular basis at a very low price or at a typically nice price. It's going to go all the way up. Like, I think the cheapest thing will probably end up being all of like $7 for the cheapest thing that you could possibly buy. We'll say $6 or $5 to be nice. $6 or $5 for something that you would normally pay like $1 for or 99 cents for. And the rest of the shit's going to be in the 20s or the 30s or, $20, $30, $50, $100 for all intents and purposes for all the rest of the shit that you normally have to pay for. You would normally pay like regular price for. It's typically how it will work. So shit's going to triple, quadruple, probably triple or quadruple for all intents and purposes in price, because everybody's going to want their profit no matter how you look at it, because all the stores are not willing to take a gamble or take a hit on selling you stuff for the same damn price when they can actually make more money. Because typically how it's going to work is everybody's going to start advertising towards black people who are getting this reparation, so therefore prices are going to go up. It's typically like the Black Friday sale. Good example of Black Friday sale that a lot of people seem to miss is if you look at all those products in January, February, they're actually at their cheapest. So at the end of the year, as they're actually gearing up for Black Friday, the prices are actually going up. So until it gets to Black Friday, that'll probably knock anywhere between $10 off of it or $30 off it, and it sounds like a great deal to you because at the beginning of the year when you should have got it in like February, January, it would have been at the cheapest that you could possibly buy it at. Black Friday actually is sold at a higher market rate price, and the sad part about that is what people don't know is the TVs that they sell at the Black Friday sale are typically TVs that are pretty cheap any damn way and are selling at a high rate. So it's not the TVs that you normally see on the shelves anyway. So the quality of the TV is not always the greatest, or the quality of the product that you're buying are pretty much would be like the generic knockoffs of that version of the products that you're buying for Black Friday sale. So think of it like that. They'll basically just raise the price on cheap ass products for all intents and purposes. And that's typically how all that will work in a nutshell. And the sad part about that is, like I said, if the best way to possibly do it and make it work without shocking the shit out of the economy would be paying it out to black people like it's a paycheck for all intents and purposes, or paying it out to black people like it's a Social Security, not Social Security, SSI check or something along the lines of that, or like you would for like SNAP or public assistance for all intents and purposes. It's typically the best way to actually make it work and make it so that the economy doesn't take a huge hit when you actually pay out people. Now, I'm not saying that it'll actually happen, but if it was to happen, that'd be the best approach to actually take. On top of the fact that you would actually have to deal with the psychological trauma that a large chunk of these people actually went through and go through, and the fact that they believe themselves to be this, and look at themselves in such a negative light that you want to unfuck that and basically make it so that they would be productive citizens of society and quite possibly invest in themselves and be a productive citizen of society, like I said, for all intents and purposes. So at the end of the day, this is typically how you're going to have to deal with that situation if the government was to actually dish out this situation and make it put it into fruition, which I highly doubt they ever will because they always talk about it, but they never actually do it. That's about it for this last stream. If you missed it, go back and look at the beginning. Y'all be good to yourselves. Be great. Adios, my niggas.